boulevard, I plant my dreams. Permaculture flows like sweet streams. I'm the daddy with the know-how seed. Creating the world like it's meant to be. Permaculture, P-I-M-P, I'm the king. Wrapping love in everything. Bringing change, making it last. Join the permaculture.
Welcome to episode 423 of the Permaculture Pimpcast, where PIMP stands for Permaculture is my passion. The only Pimpcast on planet Earth where we discuss permaculture, preparedness, practical living, and sometimes prostitutes.
Permaculture, P-I-M-P, with soulful rays in the VIP scans where we
Oh yeah, good to be here with y'all. Episode 423. What do you know? Oh man, this is moving along. This episode, as always, brought to you by the Sovereign Health Summit. That's going to be on October 27th through the 31st. Over here in my neck of the woods in North Carolina, TPC, Tango Papa Charlie, will get you 5% off. We're going to have Barbara O'Neill in the house, along with a number of other folks that are going to show you how you can get well and sustain it without having to go to the pharmaceutical industry. So we're really looking forward to that. And by the way, for the people that don't want to travel, it's okay. We're going to have an online paid version as well. So you can see it whether you want to be there in person or whether you don't. Also, I need to go ahead and put up this interview that I did with Inessa from Nessa's Hemp. And that's going to be 10% off with promo code PERMA. Folks, remember, I don't bring anybody on this show talking about anything that I don't personally use, at least not most of the time. And when I do, I let you know. But I've been using that product for over a year and a half. Look, for all you hooter bandits out there, if you think this stuff is going to get you high, that's not how this stuff rolls. This is CBDA or alpha. And she explains all the virtues of it in the interview that I did with her. But it might have been sensitive content for YouTube, so I went ahead and we did it on Rumble, but I think I'm going to go ahead and edit that and make sure it gets out to the wider audience here. And then finally, My Chronic Silver. And I ain't talking about the Snoop Dogg album from the 90s, not the Chronic, but My Chronic Silver. And folks, I use that stuff just about every day, even use it on our animals when we have to. So you want to go over there and check out the virtues of that stuff because it does work. 10% off with promo code PERMA. And finally, now this is probably going to bust open all the floodgates right now, but everybody's been breaking my chops over not having bone sauce. Well, we got it now. It's back in stock. We just put 10 of each back on, and I'm guessing by the time we're done broadcasting today, they'll all be sold out. But who knows? I mean, I've been making this stuff like crazy since we now have the weather conditions to do so. Because when it was as dry as it was, and we haven't had rain in a while, I don't have the expert that we have today, Matthew Trumm, to be able to tell me, oh, shoot, you got a fire, bro. Here's how you deal with it. So that's exactly what we're going to get into today. All right, y'all. I'm gonna set this up in a way that maybe a lot of you may not expect. And by the way, for everybody coming in the house, if you would hit that thumbs up, tell everybody we're live so they can go ahead and start suppressing us. You know, if you got any questions, please put them in big capital letters, because when I'm wearing these birth control glasses, folks, it's tough for me to see anything. So anyway, about the rice knives, I think we're going to have someone on there as well. Thank you, Nancy, for pointing that out. Now, folks, you might be thinking, well, I don't have to worry about fires. That's not something we have to worry about. Well, if anybody's been keeping up with the news as of late, what just happened in Nebraska, for crying out loud? In the prairie, they called it the mega fire, biggest fire of all time in Nebraska. What about the Eastern Carolinas? You know, not far from where I live. This time last year, I mean, I was going to another Barbara O'Neill event, and cinders on either side of me. And they were even talking about shutting down the event. That's how bad it was. How about the Florida Everglades? Not long ago, folks, I'm picking out fires that are historically not happening in the places where they normally do, or ones where they were woefully not, expecting them at all. What about the Olympic Peninsula? High humidity up there, but they've had fires. How about the Alaskan boreal regions? Burning. The LA fires. I mean, that place still not recovered. And how about Hawaii? Not to mention the Texas Hill Country and all these other places where fires have been going nuts. So, folks, if you've seen a pattern to the show as of late, you'll know that we are spending a lot of time on preparedness. And judging by some of the responses I'm getting, people are thankful because you're thinking, well, I never really thought about that. Folks, I live in a temperate rainforest here in Western North Carolina. And we've had fires like nobody's business, especially with all this Chinese silvergrass that they brought in from the government. Somebody lights a match and then bam, next thing you know, everything's Kentucky fried. So that's why we got Eric Seider, my man, Matthew Trumm on here today. And we're going to be talking about all things. Well, we're going to be talking about a number of things, but right off the bat, look, ordinarily I would do some kind of intro for you guys, but I'm not going to do it a whole lot of justice right now. Eric, let's start with you. And for all the people, hey, folks, if you haven't seen him before, this is the guy that does all of our little, the highly popular segment on this show that everybody waits for, myself included. This is Eric. Eric, give everybody a little background on yourself. You're a superhero. You got an origin story, bro.
Sure. So I've been involved in permaculture for almost 20 years now, working with Jeff Lawton pretty much from the get-go. And largely my experience has all been in aid work, worked in Jordan in the Middle East, a few different things around Hawaii, and then back to the South Pacific on Vanuatu, which if you don't know where that is, it's pretty close to Fiji. So I always like to talk about the difference between Jordan and Vanuatu. Like, you couldn't have two different climates, two different situations, but the fact that one in Jordan, you're just trying to get anything to grow you possibly can. And then in Vanuatu, I mean, you could spit a seed in the ground and have a food forest, but they traditionally don't know anything about design. They don't know how to create compost and fertility where they live. They would just, go hack a hole in the forest, plant their gardens, and then when they used up the fertility, they'd move along, but they couldn't keep doing that because the population was growing. So it's just a great example of that. The principles of permaculture pretty much work anywhere in the world.
Oh, sorry, muted myself here. That's what I'm talking about, y'all. There he is, the permaculture pimp daddy himself, Eric. So, and he's been for those that don't know, he's been a massive inspiration, not only for me, but for my son and my wife as well. So, I mean, Eric is a friend that, he's one of those guys that when you have him on board, man, you don't want anybody else. I mean, he sets the bar too high for other people to ever cross into being your friend. And by the way, folks, he makes all those shirts, all those pimp daddy ballin' shirts that I wear. That's who you want to go get them, including some of the ones that are more, a little more controversial. The latest being the one I did in the streets of Asheville. We all niggas now. Yeah. So look around in this world, folks, and that's exactly what's going on. So if you want those shirts, including that one, feel free to go buy it. So, Matthew, let's get over to you, my man. You're the man of the hour, too sweet to be sour. So let's talk about your origin story, bro. What brought you to this space?
Oh boy. Well, I just say that I read a little book called One Straw Revolution. I started off as kind of a prepper, in the mountains, burying some food, in the hills, if you will. More of a, thinking I can, cut my little corner out of the world and, rugged individualism, that kind of thing. And, that doesn't really work out in the end. You find out, I was going down the path, of, well, okay, if I'm going to be more sustainable with food storage and this kind of stuff, that I need to grow my own food, obviously. And that's where it started. And very, just normal, like growing at first, always organic, just because I knew that was right. And I was doing research and found, this book, One Straw Revolution, actually recommended by a buddy. And that kind of opened my eyes up to looking at things a little differently. I basically, just kept going down the rabbit hole, found food forestry, started doing a little dabbling, and then found permaculture, found Jeff Lawton, actually was also my teacher as well. And right into that real like mainframe design perspective, which really didn't hit me right away. I was still in technique mode for a long time. And then, over time, finally, this, idea of design really started to show itself to me. And it just totally took over my mind, and infected me. And I couldn't see the world any differently, and so I found permaculture as my passion in life. And I've been doing it ever since about 2009. Started my own business about 2011. And then the official one that I've been running with this whole time, the brand Treetop Permaculture, that I started in 2014. And yeah, I started a food forest so I was in the mountains on 12 acres in the forest. And then I moved down to urban space and I started a 3rd-acre food forest in downtown. And so kind of both perspectives. I'm very glad I moved into downtown because, 2018 was the campfire that burned up the town of Paradise. And that was kind of where I got into, that whole world of fire and fire response. I was teaching permaculture courses, had, a bunch of connections of like different resources that I've been getting for projects and stuff like that over the years. And just kind of kicked into action to help respond to the fires, and yeah, lend my advice, and then find out, they're inviting me up on stage with like the sheriff and the mayor and, all these like forestry service, all these big wigs, and I'm like one of 7 of these guys up on stage somehow. And in this big fire conference right after the fire. And I was like, wow, okay, nobody's really thinking about these regenerative perspectives. And they started asking advice, and that's kind of where I've been. Not my choice to go down that road, of fire and post-fire sort of disaster recovery. But that's what I've been doing since 2018. And the property that I was living at before in the mountains actually burned the next year in 2020. And so then I had a personal experience with fire, and then went through the whole process of recovery on my own land and my own experience. And kind of, anyways, that's where I am today. Yeah, I could tell you more, but that's a bit.
That's a good place to start. Before we get hopping and popping on this, Eric, you wanted to make a couple of announcements regarding, for the people that are going to have to bounce early and maybe come back, a joint project you guys got going on. Let's go hit that up front, and then we'll circle back to it at the end.
Well, we're kind of collaborating on a school food forest garden program. It's something Matthew has developed, and I'm pretty much just stealing his recipe and trying to get busy on that in Sacramento. But he's so he can definitely tell you a bit more about the impetus and what he noticed to actually make a more long-lasting school garden project, one that actually works. And essentially it's more of a living classroom. So I'll kick it over to him and get that going.
So, this was like full circle here. So I, when I was doing my work in Oroville, when I moved down from the mountain, I actually had just met Toby Hemingway in Sacramento, like a few months before I got offered this gig at this school garden. And he just came out with his book, Permaculture Cities. And this was right before he passed. And we met, down there in Sac. And, I remember talking to him because I was living off grid at the time, about 30 minutes from town, same like what he was when he wrote Gaia's Garden, the book that most people, maybe their introduction to permaculture potentially, a lot of people, that was their first book. It was one of the first books that I read in the permaculture realm. And he had just moved to Seattle a few years before, and then wrote Permaculture City. And so this was his tour for that. And I remember talking to him, and it was like, well, why did you move? That was a beautiful property. Like, why did you move from there? And he kept going into all of the energy order of living off grid, living far away from town and everything. And he's like, actually, there's so many more connections between elements, and resources when you're in town and all these things. And, I was like being stubborn because I lived in the mountains and I loved it up there. But at the same time, all these things he's talking about, like, you have to get gravel for these driveways. You got to drive into town if you want social systems, whatever. And and so I basically pondered that. And then I was in town. I did this compost workshop at a school. And, we put it in a compost system there, a 3-bin system at the school. And they liked it so much, they had offered me to be, a teacher at the school. I was like, well, I've never taught kids or anything, this isn't anything I don't know if I feel comfortable with this. And then not too long after that, this opportunity for this home came up, and I was like, here, Toby passed, like right then, like it was like in that same period. And it was just like this big, weird moment of like, maybe this is what I'm supposed to do, And so I moved into town and I started working at this school, and I realized that real quickly that, these school gardens are set up in a funny way, a lot of them, and I talked to other schools, and a lot of them had been abandoned and stuff. And it was just some disorder amongst these school gardens. And I was like, what is going on with it, And so I really tried to tackle that, and actually taught at a school garden symposium the next year in Sacramento. And I met a bunch of teachers all across California, and, basically like, asked them what's going wrong. And so I sort of put together this system over the next couple of years. I call it the Cornerstone School Garden Program. Cornerstone, because I feel that, it is the foundation for getting kids introduced into this regenerative mindset, right? And I've tried to teach adults for many, many years. And you know how it goes, like people come with all their preconceived ideas, and you have to do a lot of unlearning with adults, right? But the kids, you don't have that issue. The problems with schools was that too many of them tried to focus on, production in the gardens, and other things that, like we think about in permaculture, like for instance, school, time, time and space order, right? So school is out for summer, right? And it starts in, say August or September, and then it goes till May. Well, most schools plan a summer garden. I'm in California, so we're Northern Hemisphere, Mediterranean environment. Most schools plan a summer garden, and then all the kids go away for the summer, right? And a lot of fruit trees are producing all summer long. And then they come back, and it's the hottest time of the year. And you're like, come on out to the garden. The kids are like, no, I don't want to do that. And so what I did, simple things like switching to a winter-centered garden, making the production as the secondary function to education and fun. So focusing on fun, focusing on the education factor, not so much production. So I shrank the annual garden, and I grew the perennial system. So I put in a food forest, and I put in a bunch of really easy herbs and things like that all over. And we just started planting all over the school. And we went from we had 5 fruit trees, or maybe 10 when I started. They were just sad little things, and we're up to about, I want to say 60 something fruit trees now at the school. We have a beautiful nursery now that we grow fruit trees and things like that. And experiential learning is the focus. So a lot of, focused on with the K through 5. So my program is K through 8, the original one that I had for 10 years. And the K through 5 is like total experiential, especially the littles, it's just get out there. And every day, we have a set plan, but if there's something that comes up, like say there's some lizards or there's some snails, like we had snails in our chard the other day. And so I was like, oh, look at all the snails. And, the little guys, they started picking the snails, like, oh, look at the baby snails. And next thing you know, they had like 10, 15 snails each in their hands. And they picked the snails out of the garden for me. And they loved doing it. And then we took them inside and brought them to the principal to show the principal and freak her out a little bit. But they were having so much fun. And most of these kids had never seen snails, never held snails. So they weeded the garden. They had a great experience, and they'll never forget it. Just as an example, and as we go up, through the grades, I slowly but surely introduce permaculture design to the students, starting with the ethics, the principles. Like we'll do a 1 principle a day thing in the elementary, and then all the basic stuff for gardening, how to plant, how to compost, soil, all that kind of stuff. So by the time they hit 6th grade, they know how to do everything. They understand permaculture design completely. They understand ecosystem function. They're dialed in way more than any adult that I deal with, that's in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and so it's quite amazing. And junior high, we go into a club. So it's called the Junior Garden Club, where they actually, get to make choices of what they do. And I start to introduce the idea of making money, right? So now we grow the plants and we sell plants in the nursery. We start to make products. We do spice blends. We do fruit leathers. We do other products. We sell those products. And they get to make those choices, and they start to understand wow, I can make some money doing this. And last year actually was the first year. That was my goal. We paid for all of our supplies for the program based on the sales in the Junior Garden Club. And it's pretty amazing. And so the only thing I've been wanting to do for a long time is start a high school program, because they were dropped off at 8th grade, and that was kind of sad. And so I've been contemplating this high school program for a long time, and finally formulated it. And with Eric's help, we're dropping this year. It's called the Regenerative Industry Pathway Program. RIP is the acronym. And what it is that now they go into a work experience meets a careers program, to where they've now gone through the junior high ideally, but they don't have to, but they basically can earn work experience credits. Because in California anyways, we have, and I think a lot of states have this thing called work experience education, where they, every 15 hours of work experience, they earn a credit for high school. And so I'm starting it off by having them come and work with me in the garden classes as aides and stuff like that. But they can work in the nursery. They can work as, doing irrigation, design, you name it. Of course, we got many other bigger plans, but that's a nutshell. So I took on my first students this year for the RIP program. It's awesome, seeing them, and the wheels turning and stuff. And it's my vision of how we create the next, workforce of permaculture practitioners and regenerative practitioners.
Cool. Yeah. Get them when they're young. Yes. That's what I'm talking about. Eric, let me kick it on over to you for a minute. Let's talk wildfires. Now, is it just me? Well, let me not ask a leading question, or at least to my extent. Are wildfires becoming more common, or is it just people are paying more attention these days?
Well, both. They're probably paying more attention because they're becoming more common. But Matthew can definitely speak more intelligently about why, wildfires are becoming more extreme and more common. But it's definitely there's a lot of fear around wildfires. So like anything, people go to the extremes, they kind of overcompensate and start doing things like they can't have any plants around your house. They're all going to burn. And it's really, from my perspective, it's all normal permaculture practices, water access structures. You start with water. You can get yourself out of a lot of fire danger just doing proper water harvesting. And I don't think there's a better climate to demonstrate the need for water harvesting than the Mediterranean climate here. But just one thing to piggyback on Matthew's high school program is, as a coincidence theorist myself, so my permaculture group in Sacramento, our first high school project happens to be at kind of an unusual high school. It's a small student body, but their focus is on work experience and internships. So that just happened to be the connection that I made. And so it just dovetails perfectly with what Matthew's setting up. And then, kind of coming at it from the other direction, starting with the high schools first instead of the K through 8. But yeah, I think with our collective knowledge and, obviously anything to do with a public school, there's always going to be bureaucracy and nonsense, and most of them have no money. So I think focusing on revenue generation from what you can do, and not like the whole idea of we're going to grow all the food for the high school, I think it's kind of a nonsense idea for the students and the teachers to be part of that. What I think would make a lot of sense is that's like a business for somebody, that there's all this land that the schools have that they don't do anything with. So that could easily be a market gardener that wants to create a farm on the school property to then sell whatever the arrangement to give good, healthy food to the school. But it doesn't have to be the school's responsibility to grow their own food, because, most of them are overworked and underpaid.
No, I think that's a great point, and it also brings up something from my own experience. I remember, if people ever thought about how much land is owned by churches that they don't use for anything at all. There was one church that I was going to near Asheville. Well, I bet there was a good 15 acres that was right there. I mean, I can't even begin to tell you how much food you could have raised out of there. And cleaned up some of the woods that are down there just by running pigs or goats or something like that. And when I approached them about it, they're like, I'm like, nobody's doing anything with it. So it seems like we have a wasted opportunity all the way up and down. Swinging back to this fire risk, I think enough people, myself for a time included, don't really put a lot of thought into fire risk. So Matthew, I mean, where do most people go wrong when it comes to wildfire risk or fire of any sort?
Yeah, I mean, it really starts with understanding how, these ecosystems function. Honestly, I mean, you could look at a surface level and you could put Band-Aids on and talk about hardware, hardscaping. I mean, it is true that, your house is the last line of defense, and there is a few simple things that anybody can do around their home to protect their house from wildfire, like making sure that there isn't anything that's dry and organic right next to the house if you're in a fire ecology. Things that can ladder to the home, wooden fences connected to the home. For instance, even just in a 10-foot section, if you replace that 10-foot section of wooden fence with metal, if you replace your wooden pergola, say with, steel or something, or you can even cover it, which, I love cob, I love natural building and stuff. So, covering with earth and plaster is another option if you can. The screens that go up to the vents, down to 1/8 of an inch vents, on the attics and the basements, making sure that the gutters are cleaned out, things like that. But water, as Eric mentioned, being in relationship with water, having water systems readily available, having water storage. If you have land that has gravity fall, you want to have water storage high up in the landscape, because one of the first things that happens in a fire is that the power goes out. They'll cut the power because that can cause further problems when the fire goes through the power lines. So they cut the power off. Of course, you could have a backup generator. That's great. But even if that fails, you know how it happens. If you don't use it very often, sometimes there's going to be something that goes wrong. Foolproof is gravity, right? A tank with gravity going to sprinklers, going to fire hose, things like that. What we found is that one person that's a little bit knowledgeable left behind in these fires. I mean, of course, public service announcement, I'm not advocating that you stay behind, but actually if you are knowledgeable enough and you can stay behind, and you know what you're doing, you can put out spot fires with a fire or with a little hose. There was a guy in Concal, this one of the big fires that broke out here, and he literally saved his and his neighbor's house with a 12-pack of beer. Because that's all he had. There was no water, and he was literally cracking beers and like pouring out little spot fires. And it's literally as simple as that sometimes, because the initial fire that comes through isn't actually what usually burns the house down. It's the embers that land and start little spot fires that actually cause the problem. And of course, a moist, landscape, a landscape that has the right kind of trees, the right kind of plants, good design in a fire ecology, that have, broad leaves, many broadleaf trees, and most of those are fruit trees, near the home, right? So you maybe want to replace, let's say an oak that's right near the house with something that's also going to provide some shade eventually, say a mulberry or something like that, and that has broad leaves, and they can actually stop the fire as well. But yeah, that's little things that you can do. But understanding the ecology ultimately is that's the long-term fix, is understanding like why these fires occur in the first place. Because we're way out of balance with, these systems, and we're kind of at a tipping point where we've lost a lot of the function in the ecosystem, and all these animals that used to be here, and the fire in our ecologies here, the natives used to burn frequently, every year or every 3 years. They used to burn the the forest on purpose, for native plants to germinate, to create more habitat for the grazing animals, so they could have better hunting, and so forth. And those fires burned, but they burned cool because it was a constant regime. There's a quote that says, you can light fires in the best of conditions, or you can fight fires in the worst of conditions. The choice is yours,
No, that's a great point, because you're bringing up something that I was going to ask about anyway, and that's the intervention that we've done in society, whether it's clear cutting a place that probably ought not to be, or unobstructed wind, or how much of the disasters concerning fires are man-made, do you think? And if we just kind of left more of the natural systems in place, how much? Because every time you turn around, now I'm one of those people, and I'm just going to say it straight up here, I'm one of those people that thinks that a lot of these fires are being orchestrated. When you look at what the UN maps for sustainable development are, sure is curious that a lot of them, especially in California, seem to be happening in those places that they've already made little contracts for. There's a lady, actually, Deborah Tavares, who's actually out in California, and she probably blows the whistle on this more than anybody. But I guess what I'm asking is, how much of this stuff is man-made or man's irresponsibility, and how much of it can be prevented?
It's a hard one to answer exactly. Obviously, we don't know for sure about some of that stuff, but I've seen the same, kind of things. I've, obviously been in this realm for a while. I used to talk about geoengineering and all this stuff. 15 years ago. before anybody was talking about it. So I know, I mean, these things are happening. It all contributes, but really we're dealing with a system that has been degraded for a very long period of time already. California, probably one of the fastest, other than, say Australia, a few other places, degraded spaces, over such a short period of time. So I'm teaching a course on this subject, and the very first section of the course is all about ecosystem understanding, ecosystem function. It's essentially like an element analysis, but looking at mainframe ecosystem function in fire ecology. And this is a practice that I think anybody can do in any scenario, to look at how your system should be if it's in a healthy system and where it is now. And all you got to do is right where you're standing, right where you're sitting right now, is you got to just go and time scout back in time, and you think about what was there in a healthy ecosystem before it was colonized, degraded, whatever. What was that system like? What animals used to exist there? Here in the Sierra Nevada mountain range, we had massive old growth trees. We had, the golden grizzly bear, in the foothills in the valley, every 15 square miles, massive, bears. We had salmon going all the way up into the mountains. You drop in ocean nutrients, being carried out into the forest by bears and birds. We had so many birds here. Feather River is called the Feather River because there's always feathers going down every time you looked. Literally black out the sky, birds, tule grass, 6-7 feet tall, and full canopy of trees all the way to the coast. A much different environment, that we have today. And the natives were burning, in that system. That's important to understand, is that, they were burning in a healthy ecosystem, and they were doing patches at a time, and the system recovered because there was a healthy ecosystem around it, right? So it recovered much quicker. The trace minerals from the bugs and the birds being spread around and everything, the forest health, right? It's so huge. And these old growth trees, imagine the function that they provided, the shade, the windbreak, the genetics, the strength of the genetics that they had, and so many other things. So, and now where are we at, right? We've logged all the old growth trees here. We hunted hunted, and most of those animals, a lot of those animals are extinct. Eric lives near a place called Elk Grove, in Sacramento. Nobody knows what an elk looks like in Sacramento. There's no elk around. We had millions and millions of grazing animals in the valley, like herds, like thousands and thousands in a herd going through this area. They were eating all that new growth vegetation, right? So when trees were cut or burned, all that new growth came up, and these animals came through and they mobbed it, because they were tight packed with predator pressures, just like we do in holistic grazing, right? We mimic that with electric fence. And so, that's why, and they dropped all that nutrient, right? It was like mob it down, drop the nutrient. System is going into succession. The cycles are moving forward. And so, now that's all gone. And so we try to do like maybe one or two things, like we focus on brush, right? And people think logging, grazing, and that kind of thing. And it's good. It's not a bad thing necessarily, there's good in all of that. But if we only log and we only graze and we don't think about the other elements that need to be there, then we're basically desertifying the situation. We're bringing in the dry continental winds, when we open up these spaces, and those continental winds are pooling in to the forest. And I'm working with Ben Mismer right now on, we're working on an animation over a 40-year period of the forest based on real data that we're getting, showing this what happened since 1984, ironic, till now. And it basically it was the over logging of the systems, massive clear cuts connecting together that drew the high desert wind from Nevada through these areas, and it totally corresponds with the drought, and then right after that, the mega fires. And you can see the same pattern in every single mega fire that I've looked at. And so, it's, I say that the ecosystem is a battery and the life is the charge on the battery. In this case, we remove the battery, we drain the battery, and we also use the battery, the light, the battery, the charge, I should say, on the battery. And so we're kind of at that like 20%, your phone gets down to 20% and it starts to malfunction, and it's at the end there. That's kind of where we're at metaphorically with these forests and this wildfire situation.
Eric, where you are, do you see any effort by the powers that shouldn't be, or the city officials, state, whatever? Do you see any effort at all, despite all the calamities that have recently happened right in California? I mean, if somebody's waiting on the government to step in and help out, I mean, do you have any realistic hope that that's going to happen, or is this something that you're going to have to work out for yourself?
Yeah, I wouldn't put too much hope in the government getting their act together anytime soon. I think it's like anybody that comes to permaculture, you quickly realize we're the only game in town and we're the only ones with reasonable solutions. So I think it's also, it's a good point to bring up, is that, there's kind of like the clear cut, side of the equation. Then there's the, humans are bad, don't touch anything side of the equation. And they both lead to problems. So
Right.
If you're not doing any management in the forest, you're letting all these sick and diseased trees grow up, which they die and they become kindling. Or if you're clear cutting, then you're opening up massive areas for basically changing the ecosystem, because the forest can't do its function anymore. So in classic permaculture style, we can actually combine the two and realize that we are part of nature. I think that's one of my big issues with a lot of the environmental people, is they think humans shouldn't, like, there's nature over here and humans over here. It's like we need to mix together. We need to provide our resources in a way that benefits the planet. So there's so many livelihoods that could be, there's work for generations just in managing the forests. You could, whatever, just thinning it in a sensible way. You got firewood forever. You could graze animals through. You can make, how much amazing pork could we have being fed on acorns in all these oak forests? So I think there's just a sensible way that everybody can benefit. And unfortunately, our government's either too worried about lining their own pockets, or just too full of bureaucracy to get out of their own way. Hopefully, with the course Matthew's developed, and, we can get the ear of some forward-thinking people, we could actually, make some changes. But I would say don't hold hope for anybody coming to save you. But there's definitely a lot you can do yourself, with your own property. And the more of your neighbors you can get together in a whole mainframe water harvesting system, you guys could be the island, the oasis in a scarred landscape for sure.
That's exactly what it's going to take. I've given up any hope at all. As I mentioned at the top of the broadcast here, this scourge, what they call the scourge of Western North Carolina, is this Chinese silvergrass. It's not native to here. Nothing will eat it. And it grows up long. And honestly, if you don't know anything about grazing, you will think, okay, and there's a lot of people that think this. They're like, oh, shoot, I can't do anything with this stuff. So they go out there and foolishly they burn it and then set a whole mountain on fire, because they have no idea that, oh, shoot, what does this stuff actually dislike? Okay, I know what I'll do. I'll go ahead and put a little more fungus out in that soil, and because it's a bacteria-loving thing, and with compaction and all the other things out there, you're just making a bacterial-rich environment that only makes the stuff come back more. You burn it, it comes back even more. instead of saying, what's the permaculture way? Maybe if I just add a higher fungal component out here to the compost extract that I'm putting out, it might just go away all by itself. So that brings me to, Matthew, that brings me to something that I think is really the nuts and bolts of what we're getting down to here, because so many people they're going to hear this. They're going to like, okay, yeah, we know there's a problem. We got fires, as I said, from the very beginning, popping up in places that nobody in living memory ever recalls hearing a fire at. So if you had to pick, I mean, are there 3 top things that somebody should do to harden their home right now? For, whether they're, like I said, Nebraska, whoever thought Nebraska would be up in flames? And here it is. But if you had to pick 3 things that people could do to harden their homes right now, what would they be?
Yeah, well, I don't know Nebraska exactly, but I know Mediterranean systems better. We have speakers though from all over the world in the course that touch on different systems. One of the gals that's part of the course, Rebecca Ussolini, actually has been in the Maui area since the fires, doing a lot of the work there, and she's a permaculturist that understands more of that tropical type system as well. But I would say, like what I mentioned before, your infrastructure, again, it goes back to those really basic design principles, the water access structures situation, right? So when I work with clients a lot, with my landscape contracting business, like infrastructure, got to protect your infrastructure. Number one, what kind of roof do you have? Do you have exposed areas of your home? Can you install like a fire sprinkler on your roof? We came up with a design for, rain catchment system that collects the water and has a pump in the bottom that pumps up the water up to the sprinkler on the roof, and then it goes back into the tank, and then it keeps pumping and circulates that water. System like that, you can, if you had to evacuate your home, you can be assured that it's going to run a lot longer. And obviously you can still be filling it, but even if it's not being filled, it's going to run quite a bit longer. Setting up, like if you will, a fire moat with not just, native or not native, but I mean, it can be native or non-native, but the right kind, like I mentioned, fire resistant plants and trees around your home. And you should have an exclusion zone, right near your home, that you're not growing anything woody. You're going to keep it nice and clean, as far as, you can have an annual garden there, but you're going to keep it clean. You're probably not going to use a traditional mulch. You probably want to use a living mulch. You're going to want to keep that, moist, which is again back to like having good water resources on your land, right? So always, it's what we do every day. And this is kind of like back to the school garden thing. It's like the school garden and then responding to a disaster are like to the opposite ends of the spectrum. Okay. So, we're teaching permaculture in the schools because what we do in permaculture every day is the same thing you need to do for wildfires. When we have to be on the opposite end of like responding to a disaster, responding to these mega fires, that's the end of the road. Like we don't want to have to be there, but we apply those same principles in response, in, immediate prep for, fires, etc. But we hope to be on the winning end, right, of it, and just applying those same design principles every day. And if you're in a fire ecology, yes, you want to have heavy water focus. Where does your fire come from? Where are the summer winds, the fire winds? You got to know your aspect, right? Know where that's coming from. Could you put a pond there? Could you send your gray water system in that direction, right? You want to really focus your moisture in those areas. And if you could release water into, let's say, tanks, or if you have a pond or something in that space, you're going to be much better off.
Yeah. Eric, I'm going to go to that other side of my head where we're going to talk about the more conspiratorial side of this thing. Right now, with the testing that we've done, we know that we have aluminum, barium, strontium, and who even knows what else that's falling from the sky. And I think people like Dane Wigington, Ariana Masters, and a number of others out there have made an unimpeachable case that in some cases, even Dane's talked about that they're dropping fire retardant or anything else, I mean, from the sky. Are you aware of any way, this might be a loaded question and maybe even impossible to ask, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Is there any way to, I mean, let me put it this way. Back when I was in the Army, one of the ways in which we would make thermite required, now I got to be real careful about this or they'll pull the feed on this. I'm not going to tell anybody how to make thermite, but I will say that aluminum is about half of the components that we use to make thermite. And folks, if you don't know what that is, it burns super, super hot. Now, I'm not going to say the rest of it because I think they'll pull the plug on this thing. They're dropping aluminum out here. I mean, do you think there's intention to create the status quo that we now have where every time you turn around, there's a fire everywhere? Or do you think this is largely just poor management?
Well, I definitely think the government's trying to kill us. I don't know what other, I know that sounds extreme, but I don't know what other conclusion you can come to at this point. Like ignorance and well-intentioned stupidity only gets you so far. So I'd say there's, how many of the people are in on it? How many of the people even aware of what they're participating in? I don't know. It doesn't even really matter. It doesn't change my behavior. I get up and the same thing is, how can I get more permaculture out into the world? How can I, create more good soil, more good organisms? I think that's really on an individual level. The only thing we can do is make sure your soil is as good as possible and make sure you're growing food in your soil. And so I think that's the best defense we can have for whatever's happening, whatever you think is happening in the world, whether intentional or not. I think that's the best way we can protect ourselves with good food and good biology. And that seems to be, as you well know, Billy, really the only solution to combat most of this is back to how nature is designed. Organisms like whatever they're spraying, whatever's coming down in the sky, my garden is full of worms, full of life, and full of good food. So I think that's, and I'm, I've been doing this for a bit, but I'm far from super soil nerd. Like it's, pretty much just piggybacking on all the good people like Elaine Ingham that just recently passed and all the people that have pioneered the soil sciences. And it's really, you don't have to be a PhD in microscopy, whatever the word for looking through a microscope is. You just, use the basics and good organic matter, good practices. Don't be dumping any Roundup on the ground. And, the system shows you if you're doing things right. As Bill Mollison said, resources start to gather around you if you're doing something right. Like just this past year, I had lizards show up. Haven't had lizards, I've been on this property about 4 years now. There was never a single lizard when I started. There's none of my neighbors are doing anything interesting. So where the hell the lizards come from? I don't know, but I got little lizards everywhere now. And like, if you hear Jeff talk about in the Greening the Desert project in Jordan, they have rare chameleons in their food forest now. And if you have ever looked at any of the videos of that site, it looks like Mars. Like there is no wildlife corridor where a chameleon was going to slowly walk, but somehow there's rare chameleons in the Jordan, in the Greening the Desert. Like, how do you explain that? I don't know, other than they're just doing something amazing and wildlife knows where to go, I guess.
Man, I'm so glad you brought that up because, for the record, we do have an abundance of lizards and chameleons. They just happen to all be in Washington, D.C. right now and in our local and state governments. So notwithstanding those, I get the point. And you know what? And you're bringing up the answer that I was hoping you would, because really at the end of the day, what we're finding out and what we found out with the testing that we've done, even amid when they hit Western North Carolina last year with that hurricane, and everything was absolutely decimated in terms of, I mean, we had some toxicity that was off the charts. In the areas that we treated with BioComplete compost and also with the extremophiles that we got from Dr. Will, we cleaned that stuff up. And had I not had the testing, I'm sure nobody would have believed me. But $30,000 later, we come to find out that, we tied up 99% of it using biology. No matter what they're dropping from the sky, all of it was tied up in medium and long chain carbonic acids. So we know that we do have solutions all the way back when Chernobyl happened. The Lubka farm, which was downstream. And what were they doing there? They were making windrow composting there. And they found out right then at that spot, of course, they didn't let the rest of the world know about it until 25 years later, that at the time of that accident, they couldn't get a Geiger counter to go off at the Lubka farm. Why? Because the bacteria, the fungi, nematodes, protozoa, arthropods were keeping everything in balance despite the fact that they were being bombarded by radiation. And let's not forget the archaea as well. So like you said, Eric, you got good soil. It seems to me, now I can't prove that, and like you said, Dr. Elaine is no longer with us, but it sure does seem that in every case I can think of, that just having good biology out there will solve a lot of these problems. Okay, it's not going to keep them from starting a fire necessarily, but to a certain extent, it just might. So Matthew, let me kick it on down because we're coming to the end here. What we're talking about fires. I mean, is there some basic equipment that folks should have on hand, or are we talking primarily just really good design of your property?
Well, design is always going to be, the end game for me is you're going to have that. But I mean, understanding what your system is like and what was its healthy ecosystem. Are you in a woodland? Are you in a meadow, grass environment? Are you on a riparian system? What was your system like? I go back to that, when it was healthy, what were the functions in that system at that point? How do we mimic the functions of those elements that are no longer there? Like here on my property right now where I'm at, I just started, I'm on a place that hasn't burned now. And I just started a wildfire resilient course here, a local one too, in addition to my online course where I'm bringing in neighbors. And what we're doing is we're thinning, a lot of the trees around the home for one, which we're mimicking the grazers, right? We're mimicking the bears, we're breaking branches, breaking it down. We're mimicking the biology, right? By making teas, making compost teas, using fish emulsion, mimicking the salmon that used to flow up the mountain. We're also mimicking the fire. I don't know if you've ever heard of Dr. Lee Klinger, but incredible book that he wrote called Forged by Fire. I highly recommend anybody. And what he's developed is a system called fire mimicry. So, a lot of places you might not feel comfortable with burning, or can't do a broadcast burn because you're too close. You can mimic fire for the health of your trees and for the resilience of the trees by doing things like cleaning up the sides of the trees and then using a torch and actually like torching the tree on the outside. It actually kicks the tree into an immune system response, and it actually will push out bad fungi that's in the tree. It will just be adapted and better responsive to when a fire does come through as well. We're making biochar here. We're in the, Eric mentioned earlier, like one of the principles that people often miss in permaculture is that gain a yield for every action. This is such an important piece. We are part of the system, and everything in nature does this, right? Like every animal in nature is out there for themselves, but they're providing for themselves in a regenerative pattern. So everything, all their waste product is taken up by another element in the system, right? Well, we're no different, right? So we need to think about we call it fuels to tools. In the course, we have a section called fuels to tools. So we're saying, okay, as we're doing this work, because we can't just do this for free, and we can't depend on the government to be, spending billions of dollars throwing money at this problem, but it never, really solves it. And we need to see what are the other yields that we can get out of these systems. The obvious ones: fire, wood, biochar is a yield, cordage, basketry, craft wood. Like the East Coast is pretty good with the craft hardwood industry, but in the West Coast we don't have that. And I think we need to bring in those craft industries back into the forest to diversify, because all we have is timber, and we really don't need all that timber. We need main beams for homes, but we really don't, especially here in these fire ecologies. We don't need to be making our houses out of all this wood. We need main beams, and then we can use other materials. And hemp is one of the best ones. And hemp is a bioaccumulator, right? It accumulates heavy metals. And that, in conjunction with good biology, is something that we were actually recommending to the big agencies here for the bioremediation from the toxins from these fires, is how do we grow hemp in a lot of these areas downhill from where these fires occurred. No trees are going to be growing for a while, so it's got more sun. You can grow hemp for a while. You can make that hemp now into building material, hempcrete, whatever, put it with the toxins, in a stable situation inside these homes where it's not going to have a problem. It's not going to leach out into the environment. They're solving two problems at once, things like that.
Man, that's what I'm talking about, man. Wow. These are the conversations I miss, y'all. I mean, they really are. When you're hearing legitimate solutions to, all the problems that seem to perplex us every single day. All right. Matthew, where does everybody, how do they get a hold of you, or how do they get a copy of this course? Because I imagine there's going to be a number of people that are thinking, never really considered fire before, but it's something I'm definitely considering these days. How do they acquire that?
So I believe I shared the link with your wife. And so go and check out, that's the link to the website there. It's through the Ecosystem Restoration Communities. And we have a big group, and power-packed heavy hitters on this course. John Liu, Jeff Lawton is in the course, Brock Dolman. We've got Alan Booker. We've got Nick Rotundo, Paul Wheaton, Matt Powers, Miguel Elliott, Sir Kabbalat. We got Penny Livingston, who I worked with Dr. Elaine when I used to work for Elaine. Eric Olson's in the course. Casey and Keisha Ernst from Catalyst Bioamendments, and so many other experts. We got local native tribal members in the course. We've got folks that have been doing community response. So power packed. Go check it out. We've lowered the price to make it accessible for folks. It's only $4.95. We have 10% fire survivor discounts. We have group discounts. We have payment plans. Like, we made it really accessible. It's basically a 4-month course where we go through literally the holistic look at wildfire, from ecosystem understanding to design to creating a plan for your situation, holistic management essentially, and post-fire response, and then taking action and getting connected with people doing that kind of work all over the world. And as far as for me, I also sent you a link to my bio. It has everything in there, including information about our school garden program that me and Eric are working on out here. If you are interested in getting a consult to look at putting in one of these programs at your school, give us a shout. We'd love to, give you a design. We can do most of the stuff remote nowadays. We've got a lot of really good tools to do that nowadays. And I would love to share that system. It's working, and I've been doing it for 10 years now here. And I think that's the real solution. The dealing with the fire problems on that end. It's important, But to save the next generation and make sure we don't get into these problems, it's all about the school program.
Man, I think that's a winner in a big way, and I can't agree more. Eric, where does everybody find you, my man?
Well, if you want some t-shirts, some pimp gear, some remote permaculture consultation, you can go to ericseider.com. And then also, if you want to keep up with the school garden programs, I'll be updating the permaculturefaroaks.org website, and also link to some fundraisers. We just got a huge, over 300 fruit trees donated between Matthew and I, and we've been spending like the past week dealing with bare root fruit trees that are way too big. So they've been potting up and making potting mix and putting them in pots, and they're way too hot to be doing it right now. So it's been kind of crazy, but they say free ain't free, but it's easily $3,000 to $5,000 worth of trees we got to propagate more school gardens. So it's pretty awesome.
Yeah, if you're in the Sacramento area, we did this to literally seed school gardens. So reach out to us, because we'd love to gift your school some fruit trees, and then get our foot in the door there, maybe to get a program in.
Yeah, maybe not the ideal time of year to be able to to do this, but hey, like you said, free is free, man. I'll take it any way I can get it. Well, hey, y'all, thank you so much for checking us out. I want to thank my guests, Matthew and Eric, for checking us out. Till next time, y'all, stay alert, stay alive.
Wisdom from soil, permaculture dream. Let the ideas unfold. I'm moving with the truth. Feeling nature's good. Who's got the answers? All we need to do. Listen to the earth, they got us. Change, watch the world spin. From the smallest sprout to harmony begin. In the cycle of life, where the magic's alive.